So welcome everybody to our 117th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. It's great to have Brian Mills from the University of Texas presenting today. Just before he does present, just to say that first of all, if you're anywhere near Reading and you want to join us and can join us given the industrial action taking place in seemingly every sector of the UK at the moment, please do think about coming along to Reading next Tuesday and Wednesday at the same time as the World Cup semi-finals for our second Reading Football Economics Workshop. We're going to listen to talk about a different kind of football now, but just before I do let Brian go, the other thing to say is if you do want to present in this series after Christmas, you are more than welcome to. We rely on demand and supply of talks, and so there seems to still be demand for talks, which is great. And there's also a supply, but there's still a few slots left after Christmas and then up to Easter. So if you do want to present after Christmas or know someone that would or have a PhD student who would, please do get in touch. I'm also, and I think I say this quite often, I'm quite keen to get as much diversity as possible in the lineup of the series. And so if you do know PhD students or potential presenters who would take the dynamic of this series away from white men like Brian, myself, and everyone else, that would be much appreciated to encourage diversity within the field. But without any further ado, Brian's talk is titled Racially Congruent Leadership and Firm Performance. Brian, all yours. Oh, you're on mute, Brian.
I've not been on Teams in a bit, so I just hit the share contents.
Should work, yeah.
Okay. All right. Everything disappeared.
Yep. You probably won't be able to see us, but we can see your screen, so that's the main thing.
Okay, so you see the slides, not the presenter mode, right?
That's right, yep. If you just flip to the first slide, just so they can make sure it's flicking on.
That's working?
Yes, perfect.
James? Okay.
Yep.
All right, so thanks everybody, and thanks to James for having me here. I'm excited to be able to share this work. It's a piece of work that I've been working on with a former colleague of mine, Trevor Bopp. We crossed paths at the University of Florida, and his former graduate student, Robert Turek, who is now with the NCAA and one of their research associates there. As James mentioned, this is racially congruent leadership and firm performance. And as I'll explain, and I'll talk a bit more about the context, this is going to be in the context of U.S. college football at the football bowl subdivision level, which I'll talk about in a minute. So what this is really about is thinking about diversity in organizations and what that means for organizational performance and productivity. So we know that the workforce in general continues to globalize and diversify, but we also know that leadership in a lot of firms is diversifying much more slowly than the workforce itself tends to be. And this is the case as well in sport. And I know particularly here in the US, it's really a strong issue that is brought up by a number of people such as Richard Lapchick, who's done a lot of research on looking at leadership diversity across all sorts of sports here in the US. So there's both benefits and challenges related to diverse teams. One of the challenges is that there may be cultural differences between team members based on where they're from or their backgrounds, or there may also be communication or language barriers. So there's various pieces of research that actually talk about this, look at this, and how it can impact performance of firms and teamwork and individuals working together. This paper from Harrison and Klein in the management literature, though, starts to help us think about measuring diversity in various ways in firms and try to start understanding how that diversity may lead to positive effects and challenges that can be addressed directly by changing around those measures in the makeup of our workforce. And so alleviating any of these challenges is going to be very important for firms. It's not just a discrimination problem, it's a management and firm productivity issue, particularly when these challenges arrive. But there's been a lot of recent work that's shown there's a lot of value in diversifying organizations. So there's this paper from Orlando Richard and colleagues, which I'll talk about a good bit in a minute, that really shows that diversifying organizations can have really strong positive effects overall for those organizations in very specific situations of measuring diversity. So one of the things we can think about is, well, if we have a diverse workforce, how can management facilitate those workers and overcome some of the challenges that may arise from having communication difficulties or cultural differences and things like that? And so there's been a number of pieces of work more recently that have looked through how management facilitates these issues through their experiences, congruence in their background, either race or culture, how diversity itself can actually lead to better outcomes, and multiculturalism among leaders in particular. So a lot of this, I think, comes out of this really interesting paper by Zhang in 2017, talking about individuals and organizations that can bridge cultural difference gaps. And so these are known as cultural brokers. The idea that they have the ability to help people from different places come together and understand where each of them are coming from and bridge those gaps that may be causing rifts or other types of things in the organization. And so that sort of leads to this paper by Szymanski, different Szymanski than the one here today, looking at multicultural management. And this paper shows, using international soccer, that individuals with multicultural backgrounds tend to serve as really strong cultural brokers. So having those backgrounds, multiple backgrounds, gives them the ability to sort of bridge those gaps and be those cultural brokers in these firms, and in this case in sport, to improve team performance when that team is particularly diverse. Another paper looks at the role of international experience. So this is from Thomas Peters, myself, Hojun Sung, and Enrico Pennings. And what we find in this paper is we look at international soccer and we look at what happens when a country imports a coach from another country. It turns out that there may be very large cultural differences between that home country and the home country of the coach. However, when that coach has more international experience, that increases their ability to facilitate teamwork and manage the team. And those cultural differences disappear once we get to a certain amount of international experience. So there's something about these backgrounds, this experience with these different cultures that helps facilitate differences and cultural differences in these teams that may, at first look, hinder performance, hinder productivity, hinder teamwork. Now, most relevant to this paper is this paper by Richard and colleagues looking at what he calls diversity congruence. And so the idea here is that we have various managerial levels, and this paper looks at how diversity, various measures of diversity at these different levels match one another to impact productivity. And what they find is that when you match the diversity at a high and a lower level of management, we tend to see strong increases in performance from that. So a bit of a more detailed view on that. They look at upper and lower management diversity congruence. So they look at various measures of diversity at each level across a number of individuals, say in upper and lower management. And it's sort of this matching of upper and lower echelons. If you're familiar with the management literature on this, I'm not going to get too deep into that. But effectively, what they find is that this positive performance effect comes from high diversity congruence across management levels. So what that means is that when you have very high diversity in upper management and very high diversity in lower management, that tends to improve performance over having homogeneity in one level versus the other level, or vice versa. It's also much more productive than having what's called low diversity congruence across those two management levels. So what that means is that you have a management level, an upper management level that's low diversity, and a lower management level that's also low diversity. Those matches do not create the same kind of performance improvements that having both of those with high diversity, so a number of individuals with various cultural backgrounds. Now, one of the things that this paper does not do is it doesn't actually identify any individual matching or congruence on race or ethnicity. So, for example, they don't look at the specific makeup of diversity. They don't look at the racial minority status of the diverse groups. and they don't look at the role specifically of representation, particularly in these racialized minority groups. And so there's room to kind of bring this into a new light and look at individuals and how those match across these levels of management. And that's what I'm going to do today. Now, the education literature provides a nice guide for thinking about this. In the education literature, there's a number of papers that show that racial matching between teachers or professors and students facilitates performance and development, particularly in racially minoritized students across a lot of different contexts. So there's a number of citations here. This is shown in the college context. It's shown in the primary school, secondary school context as well. And so these are pretty wide-ranging effects here in the education space. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of bring that education approach and the matching at these different levels of management approach and apply that into what we're going to consider middle management. And I'll define middle management in our context in a couple minutes. So Peter, Salaga, and Jurovich do note that there's sort of a dearth of literature on actually looking at interaction in middle management and how that impacts performance outcomes of firms. Right, so they look at baseball and look at matching between upper and more middle managers and how that creates performance in baseball, and finding that this sort of matching happens, and that matching tends to improve outcomes for baseball teams. And so when we think about these different levels of management, the way I'm going to define these today are upper middle management and lower middle management. So we're not looking at a CEO. So this is below the CEO in a managerial hierarchy. And the upper middle management is going to be charged with strategic choices and direction of whatever group or area of the firm that they're running. And the lower middle management is going to be charged with successfully implementing the strategy. Right? So they're going to execute strategic choices in this sort of leadership role. And I know this is an economics seminar. I'll take an aside and note that this is a very management-y type approach to this problem. And we've sort of written this up with this management background in mind here. All right. Now, as we all know, sports provide a really nice context for us to do this sort of research, right? So we have this useful hierarchical relationship for strategic choices and strategic implementation in sport. So we have players and we have coaches. We have various levels of coaching, right? We have lots of data on individual characteristics. We know organizational goals. They want to win. They want to score points. And it's easy, and I say easy-ish, to measure team productivity, because there are various ways we might want to measure team productivity as well. Right, so I think everyone here knows the benefits of using the sport context for understanding individuals and how they impact firm productivity. And that's, of course, what I'm going to do, or what we did here in this paper. All right, so we use NCAA, National Collegiate Athletic Association, Division I football bowl subdivision football. This is about 130 individual college programs at the top level of college football. One of the nice things about this setting is that we have a pretty racially diverse workforce compared to a lot of other areas. However, we have a much less racially diverse management and leadership group in this area. It's particularly underrepresented in the coaching staff. We also have some past evidence, which I'll talk about in a minute, of real systematic biases by race in job tasking assignment. And again, I'll talk about what I mean by job tasking assignment in just a second. All right, so we're looking at American football at the college level, but at that top level. So we have effectively elite level college players and coaches that just before this seminar started, we were talking about are making $8, $9, $10 million a year. So these are really high stakes sporting events here. And the way we're going to characterize this is that we're going to characterize the offensive coordinator as our upper middle manager, right? So the offensive coordinator in football operates and calls plays for, in most teams, the offense. So the side of the ball that is looking to score points, right? Because it's not a flow type of sport like soccer might be, there are very explicit separation between offense and defense and how those are run in football. right? So the offensive coordinator specifically chooses plays for the offense. So they're charged with strategic choices and the direction of that offense. They're not really the CEO, that's the head coach that oversees the offensive and defensive coordinator. They have close contact with the offense and the quarterback, which makes them, again, not upper managers, but we're considering them upper middle managers. They tend to be more directly involved in the recruitment of players or inputs for that offense, and that's going to come up later. That's very important. They often also serve as a mentor to quarterbacks in development. We know that college sports are very professionalized, but they're also a developmental league, effectively, for the NFL. Okay. And then one of the nice things we have here is we can isolate performance to offense. We don't have to worry about the intermingling of defense and offense, creating wins. We can just look at offensive output and sort of leave aside all of that complication that comes from including defense in this as well. We now consider the lower middle manager our quarterback. All right, so they're charged with successfully implementing team strategy on the field. They're involved in every offensive play. They execute the strategic choices in a leadership role. And so we say they're similar to lower middle managers implementing that strategic choice from the upper middle management. Right? And I'm happy to talk about whether you buy that characterization after the talk as well. Right. One of the other characteristics that's really important for our context is this idea of racially stratified job tasking, which my co-authors have written about before and refer to this as racial tasking. So the principal issue here is that we have race-specific task giving by leaders. This is effectively on its own discrimination, right? So in the football context, what happens is that quarterbacks are tasked with running more often. So quarterbacks are usually thought of as someone that throws the ball forward down the field, right? That is usually their primary job. What we've seen is that black quarterbacks tend to be tasked with running more often than white quarterbacks. There's a lot of reasons why we've seen this happen. One of them is various racial characterizations and discrimination that happens in how players are recruited and the types of skills that they tend to be focused on that are systematically dependent on race when we see this happening in recruiting. But this differential tasking actually has really negative impacts on individual players. All right, so they have higher injury rates because if they're running around more, they're more likely to get tackled and be injured. There's sort of a disposition of duties as a quarterback. A lot of times, not only are they racially tasked, they may be placed in another position due to biases among coaches and things like that. There's a lack of passing development for the NFL draft. The NFL is the top level professional league, and they're looking for quarterbacks most of the time, at least historically, that are passing the ball. So if you're not passing the ball in college, you are unlikely to develop that skill to the point that you're going to make lots more money in the NFL. And then there is effectively a subsequent reduction in opportunities for future leadership positions. Right? So quarterback is a leadership position on the field, and reducing the output of those quarterbacks and the ability to move up actually reduces opportunities for those black or minority quarterbacks that are asked to be doing these other tasks more often later down the road. And so that leads to sort of underrepresentation as well in coaching. At the organizational level, there may be negative impacts as well. So passing skills that these quarterbacks have may be wasted. Defaulting to this running instead of passing more often could miss opportunities and things like that, right? So there's various things that can come about from this sort of racial tasking idea. And as we'll see, it's going to be actually really central to our result in what we see in our data. Right. Talking a while, let me introduce what are our research questions in this context. And I'll give you a preview of each result in case you want to leave a little bit early. All right. So the first question we ask here is, does matching by race take place at the time of recruitment? In other words, when we have representation of black offensive coordinators, are they more likely to recruit same race quarterbacks? We actually find pretty strong evidence that this is the case, that representation in leadership increases representation in that lower middle management position. Then ask whether that race of leadership affects that run pass strategic approach in Dremen, or that racial tasking approach. So the quarterback running, is the quarterback more likely to run or not with black coordinators? So we might have this historic development and own tasking experience for those coordinators. We actually don't find any general effect of race of the coordinator on strategic approach. We then asked, does this impact, does representation impact the likelihood of this racial tasking, which, as I noted earlier, is effectively like discrimination. So is there a reduction of that discrimination due to leadership representation? We actually find there is not, and I'll talk about that more. And then we ask, that's most central to our question, does that racial congruence between upper and lower middle managers lead to increased team performance? All right, so does it moderate how productive those teams are? And a preview here is that yes, there seems to be strong effects here in congruence, but it's sort of complicated in our context, and it works partly through that racial tasking approach to offensive output. Right. So our data are individual quarterback season observations for all NCAA Division I FBS schools. I said there's about 130 of them. I don't have the number of years in here, but it's from 2008 through 2018. We have the passing and rushing attempts, so running attempts by the quarterback, and we put those in as a proportion of all team rushing attempts. So effectively asking, holding constant the amount the team runs the ball instead of passing the ball, how often does the quarterback is the quarterback involved in that? We pair that with team level data, looking at offensive output, and we end up with about 3,500 quarterback year observations here. Our race coding is relatively simplistic. We look at just quarterbacks and offensive coordinators. These were coded by a couple of research assistants and then cross-checked by us. And we tried to come together on disagreements on these throughout that process. And we subset the data only to Black and white players and coordinators for our regressions. This is about 96% of observations. So there's a lot less wide diversity in football and football players in terms of traditional race categories than, say, baseball or other sports, which makes it sort of convenient for this more simplistic approach in the regression model. We then reduce our data to quarterback year observations where the quarterback has at least 250 attempts. So that's pass plus rush attempts, running attempts. We also drop service academies due to a unique talent pool that they tend to recruit from. So if you're not familiar with college football, the service academies are the Naval Academy, Army, and Air Force. And because they have a different talent pool, they're recruiting people for the military. They tend to run very strange, different strategies than other schools. And so we just sort of drop them so we don't have to worry about that, because a lot of that is actually related to quarterback rushes. So we end up with about 1,160 quarterback year observations in our data and about 415 total attempts run or pass on each year for these quarterbacks. So the first thing we do for our first research question is we do some cross tabulations of matches or congruence by coordinator and quarterback. Now, one of the things we do is we actually split that by recruiting condition. So some coaches are hired into a team and maybe endowed with some talent or players that are already there and have to make do with what's there. So what we do is we split the sample into two pieces. One where the coordinator was hired and did not choose those quarterbacks are already there, and another sample where they actually were present probably when that quarterback was recruited. So this is sort of a proxy for their ability to recruit those quarterbacks. I'll also revisit this later to introduce some exogeneity of those matches for our matching effect. So we just look at odds ratios of black-black matches across recruitment conditions. We assume the recruitment of the coordinator to the school is otherwise exogenous, but assume that quarterback choice by the coordinator is a preference that they have based on their strategic approach to football, right? And we're going to look at the change in white-black and black-black and white-white matches across these conditions. The main result, before I jump into the tables, is that upper middle management or the offensive coordinator representation tends to lead to large gains in lower middle management representation. So this is particularly the case for racial minorities. Effectively, if you have a Black coordinator, they are much more likely to recruit a quarterback who is also Black, or successfully recruit a quarterback that's also Black. And as we'll see in a second, this is fights against some of the really, really strong underrepresentation in college football. So as a
Brian,
yeah,
I can interrupt you. Ian Gregory Smith has a question.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, hi there. So it's quite rare for there to be a black coordinator. Is that black offensive coordinator? Is that quite a special case for a college? Are most of the coordinators white?
Yes. So right down here, actually, on the bottom row, it gives you exactly what that outcome is in our observations. So about 7.4% of all season observations are black coordinators. Yeah.
So then are you able to disentangle the sort of the general college effect of appointing a black coordinator versus the general college effect of appointing a black quarterback and the influence of the black coordinator on the black quarterback? So the point I'm getting at is that, yeah, maybe these colleges are special cases. They are particularly prone to promoting racial diversity and encouraging black appointments in all positions. And so that's why you may end up with a black coordinator, and that's where you may also end up with a black quarterback, and there may not be so much of a strong connection between the two.
Yes. So we also look at in the regression portion, we have fixed effects for school and conference. There are some changes that do indicate that this is happening at the school level. And at least from the comparison with and without those school fixed effects in the performance models, the school fixed effects, I think, tend to pick up most of that variation. And so we're looking at changes within school across black and white matches. Does that make sense? So we have.
I guess I wondered if you need like a selection model for having a black coordinator in the first place.
Yeah. So
based on like the demographic characteristics of the college, or I don't know what would predict a black coordinator in the first place.
Yeah, so we played around a little bit with some two-stage models using things like prior year or prior hiring and characteristics. Because the data are noisy, which I'll talk about in a second, and we have such particularly small samples for these multiple matches. It's tough. We start running out of degrees of freedom pretty quickly there. Yeah. But to your point, yes, there certainly could be some selection issues in here. I think looking across the models with and without school fixed effects, I'm not too worried about that though. But I'm sure there are some schools that are much more likely to hire black coordinators versus white coordinators and so on, and that leads to later recruitment. The data were just not up to the task of these multiple stage selection models. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. No, it's really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, so as I noted, you can see here there's considerable underrepresentation. So this is just a cross tabulation just to look at what does representation look like in these schools. So for some context, the proportion of all players in FBS football that are reported as black is about 55 to 60%. So if we look at the representation of coordinators, it's only about 7.4% so relative to 55 to 60% of the players. If we look at quarterbacks, it's not quite as underrepresented as coordinators, but we're still looking at a leadership role on the field at about half the representation of the overall player representation in college sport, in college football. And so we have pretty considerable underrepresentation here. And I bring this up because we have a relatively small sample of black matches in the data. This is 10 years of data, and you can see that there's a strong underrepresentation here, particularly in these matches relative to white or white any other matches, right? And so I bring that up because there is plenty of noise in these estimates, but they seem to be relatively robust using various measures of output. And I'll show some models with and without fixed effects as well that I think are dealing with most of this issue. All right, so just in general, just as a descriptive outcome, if we look at coordinator recruited quarterbacks and non-recruited quarterbacks, we can see there's actually a huge increase in recruiting black quarterbacks by black coordinators. Now, there may be some school effects, like was mentioned here, but ultimately we are seeing that there are strong representation differences here when we have a black coordinator. Looking at recruited and non-recruited quarterbacks for white coordinators, we don't see a huge change in matching here, like we do for underrepresented minority leaders here, right? And so the main part here is that we just tend to see there is increased representation, whether that is a specific coordinator or school effect. With these descriptive results, we don't really get too deep into that with this part. Mostly we're just showing that there seems to be some relationship here between those two. The next thing we want to do was replicate and extend this racial tasking result. So we wanted to estimate the propensity for black quarterbacks to be tasked with rushing more often, and estimate their moderating role of the race of the coordinator on whether that tasking happens. Right. So if we think about tasking as discrimination, and again, we don't know the point of discrimination. The point of discrimination could come at recruiting. It could come at the developmental stage when the quarterback's in high school, and then systematic differences in the types of skills that players of certain races are recruited on. We see this in other sports. So we have scouting reports for baseball players, and we see very different language used for the types of skills that are focused on in black versus white baseball players historically. Which is really useful information for this type of identification of where the point of discrimination is, right? So all we're asking is, if we have a black coordinator, are they less likely to rush the quarterback, a black quarterback, all the time relative to their paired white quarterbacks, right? So we have here a fixed effects panel model with effects for school, conference, and season, and we cluster standard errors at the school, conference, and season level. So we have multi-way clustering with this panel model. It's a simple, straightforward panel model at this point. So we're looking at the QB rush rate, or the quarterback rate of rushing, relative to the team level rate of rushing. So as this increases, quarterbacks are rushing more often, decreases, they're rushing less often and passing more. And we effectively just look at the main effects of quarterback and offensive coordinator race, as well as the interaction of these two, which tells us about whether there's a differential effect for representation at the coordinator level. Right. So as a replication confirmation, we do find really strong racial tasking in college football. So in our data, we see that black quarterbacks rush 30 to 40% more than their white counterparts at a given school in a given conference. We have some mixed effects for the race of the offensive coordinator, but there's not a lot of strong evidence in general of increasing or decreasing rushing rates, or just general strategic differences for those black coordinators, say if they had experience with that as a quarterback when they were in college. What we do see is we have some differences depending on recruited and non-recruited quarterbacks. So black coordinators tend, and I'm going to show a visual that helps us kind of think about this a little better. They tend to, it turns out, rush white quarterbacks that they recruit much less than black quarterbacks that they recruit. So this actually isn't a large increase in rushing for those black quarterbacks. It's actually a strong decrease in rushing of white quarterbacks when coordinators select or recruit those white quarterbacks. Again, I'll show this in a visual in a second. The main thing to see from here is that in general, we don't see a lot of interaction between coordinator and quarterback race on the propensity to task in general, right? There's no effect here at all. There's no moderation of that racial tasking outcome. This is a little bit different depending on the recruitment scenario. So when we have black matches at the coordinator and quarterback level, we see this very large effect. And again, that is actually from rushing those white quarterbacks that are selected much less often than the black quarterbacks that are than any quarterbacks that are selected. We don't see this in the non-recruitment scenario. And I want to just move to a visual here. All right, so overall, we see here on the left side that we have a general increased rush rate for black quarterbacks on the x-axis. And in that recruited quarterback scenario, what we see is the main part of the change or the difference in the behavior with recruited quarterbacks is rushing those white quarterbacks much less. I don't know what this means, honestly. If anyone has a really good interpretation of this, I am curious. There may be some selection issues that go into this as well. But this is the only result here that we're really struggling with really getting deep and interpreting. But the main result here, right, is overall, we tend to not just see generalized main effect strategic differences for black coordinators with their quarterbacks, right? And that was the main thing we wanted to test was in general, do we see strong differences in strategic approaches by race before we go and see how these individual coordinators actually impact performance, and particularly in matches, right? So I'll move on to that. Looking at racial congruence, the main part of this paper, and productivity output from that racial congruence. So we're going to test the role of race matching or racial congruence and the moderating effect of rush rate on that race matching effect. And it turns out this is key in the model to actually see the results that we do. All right, so we're really focusing on these two-way interactions of race of the coordinator and quarterback, as well as a three-way interaction between the two-way race interaction and the rush rate of the quarterback. So we have this offensive performance model. It's effectively identical estimation procedure to the previous model looking at tasking. We control for things like sacks, strength of schedule, recruitment, experience of the quarterback, and then the number of years that the quarterback and the current offensive coordinator have spent together. And that actually tends to be a pretty strong predictor of performance itself. So our model looks something like this. Again, we have our main effects of quarterback and coordinator race. We have our interaction of those two. We have the interaction of quarterback race with rush rate, as well as the coordinator race with rush rate. And then we have our three-way interaction of coordinator, quarterback race, and rush rate. And then we have our effects and our control variables. I don't show any of the results really for the control variables. They're all kind of in the expected direction that you would think. So sacks are when the quarterback is tackled behind the line. That tends to be bad. It turns out that's bad for performance output. Strengths of schedule means you have a lower productivity output because you're playing harder teams. I do show the recruit variable. There's nothing going on there itself. Experience is positively associated with performance. The number of years the quarterback and the coordinator spent together is also positively related to performance. All right, so this is our overall model results. In column 1 and 2 and 3, we do not have school fixed effects. In columns 4, 5, and 6, we do have school fixed effects. There's some slight differences going on here, particularly related to the propensity to rush the quarterback and the impact that has on performance. So starting with the main effects of just the quarterback and coordinator race, we don't find any general effects of race on performance output. So this makes sense. There's no reason to think that race itself would be particularly associated with performance output, and so I don't think there's any surprises there in that case. We also looked at, as I mentioned, included whether a quarterback was recruited by the coordinator and whether that has an impact on performance. In general, we don't seem to find that there's a big impact of being able to recruit your own quarterback or not. I'm sure there's some selection going into that, but there's no general effect here of recruitment on performance. We then look at quarterback rush rate. When we have school fixed effects here, we tend to see actually relatively strong positive performance effects of quarterbacks rushing more often. The reason I present this is that I think by having the school fixed effects in here, we're dealing with some of the choice or selection of that strategic approach of rushing more often or not. So when we don't have those fixed effects, we see no effect of quarterback rush rate. But the schools that maybe know how to do this better and choose to do this in the years that they have those skills, they tend to see within school increases in performance when rushing more often. We don't have any main two-way interaction effects between quarterback rush rate and or coordinator rush rate and quarterback rush rate and quarterback or coordinator race. So there's not a whole lot going on there. However, our main interests are these interactions here. And so what we see overall is there tends to be some strong positive effects of congruence in race between the quarterback and the offensive coordinator. What's really interesting is that a lot of this tends to seem to happen through rushing more often, right? And I'll talk later about why that might be the case, or why we don't have a very good understanding of the mechanism through which that happens. But there seem to be strong congruence effects, both in general and in the context of using this strategic approach of running the ball more often, right? So we can think about black coordinators having experience previously, or understanding that approach better because they've been in those situations and understand what's needed to be successful in that place. It's sort of our hypothesis here. So just visualizing this effect, one of the really interesting things about this is that this performance effect is largely a positive effect. And it's a positive effect for racialized minorities, so our black quarterbacks, with no negative effects of representation and leadership for non-matches, so white-black or black-white matches. So we really see this outcome manifesting through black-black matches in the coordinator and the quarterback, right? So the idea here is that increasing this representation improves performance when there is representation to be had, and does not decrease performance for the traditionally majority race groups that are also involved in this workplace. Now, we did do some robustness checks on this outcome. So we're using yards gained as a performance output for our teams, but the goal of the game is not to just gain yards. And there are some issues and confounds that come up with it. So teams tend to have higher yardage output when they're behind by a lot. So there's a lot more passing down the field just to try to take high risks and get points because they're way down. And so that tends to lead to more yards, but not necessarily better outcomes for a team. There's also the issue that excellent defense or special teams gets the ball closer to the end zone, and it makes it easier for the team to score, the offense to score. And so we'll see fewer offensive yards when we have really, really good defense, because they just don't have to go as far down the field. So like I said, the offense wants to score points, not just gain yards. And so we're going to run these same models with points per game instead of yards per game. And then we know that we have team level objectives. The team wants to win, not just score points. And so then we're going to replace points per game with win percentage for the season for the team. Note that this will be contaminated in particular by defense and special teams performance, the defensive coordinator race, and so on. But as it turns out, we end up with effectively identical direction and significance of effects for both of these alternative offensive output variables. Right, so just showing them together with yards per game, our key variables or effects that we're interested in. Our race matching variables are all positive and statistically significant and rather large here in this case, right? Interestingly, we see really strong positive effects of QB rush rate on winning percent as well in general. But even after controlling for that, we see additional effects when matching is using this running strategy in these games, right? Now, there are some selection issues here. And if anyone here was at Western Economic Association, interestingly, John List decided to slip into our sports economics session, which was kind of neat, and looked at these regressions and said, you have a lot of endogeneity going on there. Why don't you split the sample by whether or not the coordinator or the manager is able to choose their inputs, and see if the effect is based on them getting better success from choosing their inputs or recruiting that quarterback, or if there's still this congruence effect when they're more or less hired exogenously and exogenously paired with the existing quarterback at that place. Right, and so it was a very simple suggestion, and when someone like that tells you you should do this, you at least give it a try, right? And it turns out this was a really helpful suggestion. And so what we do is we split the sample by the coordinator recruitment condition. So the assignment of quarterbacks to coordinators is non-random. And what we're going to do is we're going to assume that the assignment of coordinator to quarterback when they're moving is more or less exogenous to the quarterback there at the time. Usually these people are brought in to develop new players and things like that. And so it's a strong assumption, but it's one that we're making here so that we have a sample of quarterbacks that were brought in specifically and selected by the coordinator or that manager, as well as a selection of quarterbacks that were not selected by that manager, right? They were more or less endowed with those quarterbacks. And this relates to what we were just talking about previously with the representation and the matching, right? And so endogeneity is all over the place here, right? And we're trying to at least address some of that by making these assumptions about assignment of quarterbacks and coordinators in these matching and non-matching conditions, right? Sorry, I just talked about that. So again, the added value is that it also provides additional information about the benefit to managers choosing their own inputs and strategic implementation, right? So there's lessons for hiring practice, for upper middle management input and labor and lower middle management choices, right? So we're going to fit the exact same models here. I'm going to return to yards per game because we find effectively the same thing, irrespective of the dependent variable that we use. And we're just going to fit these models separately for recruited and non-recruited quarterbacks. All right, so I have the original model in all the way on the left, and then on the right here are the recruited and non-recruited subsamples. So notice that the recruited sample is relatively small. It's under less than 300 quarterbacks, which means we have pretty small samples here, and the data are relatively noisy. Oh, these slides are out of order. That's okay. So the first thing to notice is that our main effects of racial congruence tend to be in magnitude pretty similar to the pooled effect. The recruited sample coefficient is not statistically significant. And that's why I pointed out that we have a pretty small sample here. We would like to actually expand this a bit, but it is in magnitude much larger than the non-recruited sample or the pooled sample here. However, when we interact this congruence effect with rush rate, we see that a lot of this is still happening through that choice to rush more often when we have congruence in race between the coordinator and the quarterback, particularly for these minority races. Right? So the main takeaway here is that at least this type of selection, when we split the sample, doesn't seem to be driving that original effect that we see when we're looking at racial congruence and its positive effect on this performance output for offenses. And so we can actually visualize this here. So we're looking at the race matching by rush rate effect here. So this is that triple interaction. On the left, we can see the effect for all quarterbacks. This is sort of what we saw before, right? Where we see no real changes in non-congruent matches or white-white matches. We really see just a net positive change, particularly for these black-black matches. We see a lot more noise, again, in the recruited quarterback sample, largely because I think we have a smaller sample here, but we still see relatively large effects of this congruence by rush rate. And then it's also still statistically significant and relatively large in the non-recruited sample. So again, the idea here is we're still seeing this same effect in this sample of non-recruited quarterbacks where coordinators were effectively assigned to the quarterback rather than choosing their input. And I think this makes our results a little bit stronger, at least introducing some level of exogeneity in sort of quasi-randomness in the pairing of these coordinators and these quarterbacks, right? With strong assumptions, as tend to be the case in these. All right, so just a quick recap. We have evidence of matching by race in quarterback recruitment. That alone seems to increase representation at the quarterback position or this lower middle management spot. That may have the potential to improve subsequent coaching pipeline problems that have been written about a lot, particularly in professional football. And they've actually been in the news lately. We also see that black quarterbacks are racially tasked or given those rush assignments just as often with black or white coordinators. So there's no moderating effect of racial congruence in general on this racial tasking outcome. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but this could be for a number of reasons. It could be simply that there's still bias and discrimination that happens even when there is representation at that level. There may also be these shared past experiences and better strategic understanding for those coordinators that have been in those positions before that are able to leverage or use that in a positive way. The key result, though, right, is that this racialized minority or black congruence increase performance for our offenses. So this would suggest importance in leadership representation, particularly for racialized minority players. We see this as larger when the quarterback rushes more often. There are no real negative effects of non-matches for majority race groups. But again, the specific mechanism here is not especially clear. We're using the secondary data. We're kind of far removed from this. And so I think we need to do a little bit more to try to really understand the underlying specific mechanism that's making this happen. And so I think there's some useful history here in thinking about the US sport context. So in the US, sport development almost exclusively happens through schools and school districts. We know that schools and school districts in the US are historically completely segregated, and that has been really persistent through time. Even today, we know we can draw maps that show the lines of this historical segregation by school district, which are geographically isolated and determined. And so there are various possibilities that could happen here. There may be simply stratified human capital development, skill development, strategic development, and cultural understanding or experiences that are completely stratified by geography, which here in the US is often stratified very strongly by race as well. And there's some work in more sociological spaces that note the importance of this racial or cultural competence or experience in these settings that helps athletes or individuals improve their output, improve their performance. And again, we see that in the educational context as well. The other outcome here is that if we do have increased representation, that means hiring more inexperienced managers due to that historical underrepresentation, right? So if this is going to increase performance because we have more racialized minority matches in our firms, that is likely going to mean hiring managers with less experience. Conveniently, Thomas, Stefan, and have this recent paper just came out, I believe, last month, that show that hiring inexperienced managers tends to be a net positive. It can be a higher risk proposition, right? But ultimately, on average, the outcome is positive on its own, even leaving aside these racial matching portions, right? So this seems to be kind of jive nicely with that finding as well. One of the things about college sport is that we can think about it as a firm that's seeking productivity and certainly is professionalized here in the US, but it is still also a place of development, right? So it's happening in the school context. This is more or less a developmental league for the NFL, right? And so there's some development that's happening here as well. It's not just firm performance, productivity alone. And so some recent work has shown that, again, this sort of culturally sensitive training, cultural competence is stratified by race and taught differently depending on the type of university that you've attended. And so this paper shows that historically Black colleges and universities tend to teach this culturally sensitive training in education much more than any other universities do, and shows that a big portion of the race matching effect in education is actually due to this background in that training. We were hoping to implement that here in our work, but we have very few HBCU grads in our data. In particular, I think among coordinators, there's 3 or 4 total in the data that attended an HBCU, and there's just not enough information there to get an estimate of that possible background moderating this. There's another limitation with our data. I'll talk about that if you have questions. The collection of football data is very strange. And so there's some complications with how we calculate quarterback rush rate. But I think beyond the scope of this presentation, particularly given the international audience, it gets pretty deep into thinking about American football and the characteristics there. So that is all I have. So I appreciate you all being here and attending. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this work and get your feedback. And I'll shush now and let everybody ask questions. Thanks.
Thank you.
So
Brian.
James had to. Oh,
No, I'm
James, you're
back.
back. Oh, good.
But you can ask first question if you want, Stefan.
All right, I will do that then, since since I was going to. You've denied me the opportunity to share. So, yeah, that's really interesting, Brian. I mean, the one thing I wanted to get at was, I mean, you kind of a throwaway line you said in the middle there somehow. Well, we wouldn't expect to see any differences in performance of black versus white quarterbacks or offensive coordinators, and yet. I think we should, if depending on why we think there are so few black quarterbacks and why there are so few black offensive coordinators. If we think that this is discrimination, then we should expect to see also that the black quarterbacks and offensive coordinators are going to be better on average than the white ones, just because the way you'll overcome discrimination is being better than the equivalently qualified white guy. So in that sense, shouldn't you see a significant that the black quarterbacks are significantly better and the black offensive coordinators are significantly better? And if not, why not?
So when I said that, I actually thought of exactly this. Yes. Yeah, thanks for asking that. You know, I don't have a good answer for you because I think you're right in that a lot of times what we do see is that selection results in those players just being better because you have to be better, right, to make it to that point. I'm guessing because there's such heterogeneity in school or program quality, that may be masking some of those effects here. Although we control for school, we control for year, there's limitations in terms of the human capital available by school and things like that. So I don't have a good answer for you. It could be that there's simply no discrimination. I find that hard to believe. But I think it's a really good question. And again, one that as I was saying that, I was thinking about as well. And I don't have a good answer, but it is, you know, yeah, that's if you have a good answer, I'd love to hear. I don't know. I mean, the data are pretty noisy, right? So we have relatively small samples, particularly with these subsets of subsets. And it could just be large error bars there. Some of this may be manifesting through the strategic approaches, the use of rushing more often. We see the positive effects there once we have school fixed effects. It may be manifesting through these matches and through these matches better leveraging those skills or those strategies. But we don't see any main effects even without including those in the model. And so I don't have a good answer for you there.
I just a follow-up related to that. I mean, do we have any evidence about black quarterbacks in the NFL? About are they? I mean, again, they've struggled to get representation. Do we have evidence that they have, on average, tended to be better than the white quarterbacks?
So this is something I've talked about with both Trevor and Robert, my co-authors on this, about looking at a number of things related to black quarterbacks in the NFL and its sort of intersection with this racial tasking idea. So injury risk, career length type questions. I don't know the answer to that. There may be, but I don't know of any papers that just put a dummy variable in there for race and then ask, do we see these quarterbacks better or worse than the white quarterbacks? I know Pete has done some recent work looking at stacking in baseball. Hopefully I'm describing this work right. I think presented last week or the week before. And how there tend to be some evidence that of placing black players in certain positions, but they tend to be better. Hopefully I'm describing that well. I'm trying to remember back. But I don't know about quarterbacks in football. I'm not sure. I've not found anything directly testing that. But certainly we've seen a shift, right? Probably over the past 10 years, we've seen a huge shift in the NFL in the willingness to use these sort of running strategies and draft these quarterbacks out of college that can just run like the wind. Lamar Jackson in Baltimore is one really good example. I see the box scores of those games every week, and it seems like all of the yards are gained by him, either running or passing, and nobody else really is doing anything. And so it's pretty incredible to watch. Yeah. So we've certainly seen a shift at the NFL level more recently.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Lots of time for questions and comments. So if anyone else has questions and comments, indeed, if Stefan has more, please feel free to chip in, raise your hands, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Brian, can I come in here? It's Rob. I mean, I like the paper, and it's good stuff. Really love to see it applied to NFL, actually. I think there's a lot of scope for doing that, you know, in a similar direction. Can I ask you about quarterback rushing? It seems to me that there's several reasons why a quarterback might rush, not necessarily a designed play. It could be that the pocket breaks down, the defensive line's not done its job with the blocking. It could be the wide receiver's not open. So I don't know how you get at that. I'm just wondering if there's a correlation between quarterback rush yards and overall pass yards here. That might sort of get you out of that tangle. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, you know, they're basically, it's zero sum a little bit there, right? So if somebody's throwing less, they're rushing more, and vice versa, almost certainly. I think all of those are important points related to why the quarterback runs, right? So is this just a strategy for the quarterback, or do they just have receivers that never get open? Or does the defensive line break down all the time, and so he's running for his life, right? I think that's the point you're making. And so one of the interesting things is that we had to include sacks in particular in our models because they were very large drivers of performance output. And they're also implicitly included in the number of rushes of the rush rate. And so this is only partly answering your question. So we did a little bit of that in trying to get the correct run choice by looking at how often the quarterback was sacked. That's integrated into that run choice. And that part is actually really important in estimating our effects. We get much smaller error bars when we include sacks in there because this is a really noisy measure, right? The problem for looking at guys downfield, there may be some data on this more recently, but it's a really difficult thing to measure on whether a receiver is open or not, right? And one of the difficult things in football, and just watching it, right? We could go watch a bunch of games and look at the average openness of receivers. The camera doesn't show the receivers and whether they're open. And so we don't see that. So more recently, there's lots of tracking data in the NFL that you can actually measure this much better. It would be great to get that. I don't think we have that at the college level, and it would only be the last couple of years, probably not even in the span of data that we have. But I think it's a really good point. We're assuming, right, that a quarterback that runs way more often is at least largely driven by strategic choice, whereas sort of in the middle, if they're running more often, it may or may not be. So we're mostly looking at these quarterbacks that really clearly run much more often, I think, in these cases where we see these performance improvements. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I'd love to do this at the NFL. I just wonder about there being enough data for that. I feel like we've got 10 years of 130 teams in the college data, and we're already feels like a relatively small sample to test these sorts of things. And so I think it'd be great to do it in the NFL. I think there might be some struggle in sample size issues there.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob. That's fine. Any more questions and comments? Ian.
So I suppose another interesting aspect of quarterback performance is not just how they perform when they pass and how they perform when they rush, but the quality of the decisions that they make. So almost uniquely, they are responsible for sort of executing those play designs and relaying them to the team, and then maybe changing them at the last minute if they line up and they see something they don't like. And I guess a long-held stereotype in the NFL is that white people were better decision makers in the population than black people. And, you know, this is kind of reinforced by making these draftees take the Wonderlic test, which we're not going to do anymore. So I don't know, do you have can you get a handle on sort of decision-making quality and how the match might improve decision-making quality or not?
Yeah, I don't have any, I don't know that we'd have any access to that. There are some more recent advanced statistics types of outlets that are trying to calculate these sorts of things. It's not clear how reliable that data is. It might be interesting to include that and think about, rather than just this run choice, decision-making quality in general and how that's facilitated by, say, racial congruence or diversity congruence, those sorts of things. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a really important point, and particularly thinking about the mechanisms through which this is happening. But I don't know of a good measure of that, maybe without watching every single play and hearing the audibles called or things like that. But certainly, you know, the run choice is really dependent, as Rob was also mentioning, on other characteristics in the game that we're not really observing in our model. And I think those are really important points, but I don't have a good answer for evaluating that. But I think certainly you bring up exactly the point that this racial tasking idea is making, is that the reason we've tended to see quarterbacks running more often was this idea that there's differences by race on ability to make good pass choices. And of course, that's obvious, clear, discriminatory and bias approaches to thinking about who should be quarterback and who should be a leader and things like that. Yeah. I think it's a really good point. I think ultimately you're talking about actually qualitative research, going and asking quarterbacks, asking coordinators, what is it about this person that's your leader that's leading you to make these better choices relative to your experiences in other situations. I don't know how far we can get with this sort of data, and that's an obvious limitation for us.
Thanks, Ian. Any further questions and comments? Stefan.
Yeah, I have another thought that occurs to me about this, which is the congruence you're looking for here involves a very complex relationship. I mean, this must be one of the most complex relationships in sport between a quarterback and a defensive coordinator. And maybe it's just, in some ways, maybe it's too complicated to actually be able to disentangle such a sort of a basic thing as this. But so maybe another, but I was just thinking about other positions or other relationships on the field that might reveal this sort of relevance of congruence. And certainly the obvious one is the snap and the center and the quarterback. If congruence matters, then congruence between the center and the quarterback would matter, and you could just measure how many screw ups on the snap there are. I mean, I presume there are statistics on that. And then, of course, then if you want to go further, then the other one would be congruence between the receivers and the wide receivers and the quarterback. So maybe just to embed this in an analysis of simpler relationships, which might reveal congruence as a relevant factor.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and I think, you know, I think looking at all the levels of this sort of congruence and interaction and performance output is certainly adds to the just the upper and lower middle management idea here for sure. I think you're right in that it could disentangle, particularly looking at these, as you know, simpler relationships. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Stefan. More questions and comments?
I'm going to unshare here so I can see people. Everyone's just a little dot in the bottom.
Yeah. Well, that may be it in terms of questions and comments. In which case we can wrap up. So thank you very much, Brian. Really interesting paper. Nice little education for me on college football. And now I can return back to football. There's 5 minutes until half time in the quarterfinal match that's going on currently. Yeah, I've seen one person using the reactions to send some applause. So I'll also send you some Teams applause as well. This will be the last talk before Christmas. So Merry Christmas, everyone. Hopefully you've got your Christmas tree up already. We'll return after Christmas on January the 13th when we've got Thomas Peters giving a talk, and that will be entitled International Sorted Matching in the European Labour Market. So we'll switch continents and switch sports after Christmas. But until then, wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And thank you again, Brian, and everyone for your presentation and discussion of the paper today.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.